what is community management in games? Like, what does it mean to manage a community? I know it almost seems like a dumb question, but I think for a lot of
No,
people,
it's not dumb
they're
at all.
looking from the outside. Games now have evolved from these forums where you used to kind of
Hmm.
jump in and just have chats with players to now you have Discord and you can Facebook and all these different places where players can kind of talk about
Yeah.
the game and just make these social communities. What does it mean for games today to have a community?
I think the scary thing for me is the fact that you mentioned forums there, and that was where I started, right? So I've seen basically all of the evolution and all of the changes. And the funny thing was, is that I think when social media started to come around, it felt like it was just kind of thrown at community managers. We were kind of like, okay, I guess, right? It's talking to people, I suppose. So it kind of got absorbed into most community managers' jobs, and then it just kind of went and got bigger and bigger, from there. But the funny thing is you mentioned like, what is it? Like, I still can't easily explain it to somebody. If somebody asks me what I do, I'll usually say something like, it's kind of like a mixture between customer service and marketing, because it does tend to be one of those two things, you know, on any given day. Um, but but it is difficult to explain because it ultimately is just, obviously, as the title explains, managing your community. But um, that's there's so many different ways to do that, and there's so many different avenues to do it in, that there is really no. Well, it's not fair to say there's no communities that are alike. There are definitely alike communities, but you know, with the different tools and the flexibility of those tools and the way people have used them over the years, it's nice to see communities being diverse and being different. I mean, I can go deeper than this in the sense of like, what does community look like today? And
Yeah, please.
it has changed from certainly, when I started. Um, it kind of used to be simply enough. It used to be, your website, your official presence, wherever it was on the internet, that was like your hub, and everybody was drawn to that, right? Like, you're going to go play a game, you're probably going to look at their website, and then they may have some sort of community stuff attached, right? And in the early days, it was pretty much exclusively MMOs that were doing this, mostly because they were the ones that merited that kind of ongoing discussion, and they were really the only games that were updating in very real ways over time, right? So everybody who started in that space, the EverQuests and World of Warcrafts, and myself at NCSoft at the time, we were all building our forums because that was where we expected to talk to people. And you'd have websites and newsletters and stuff, but forums tended to be like, the key point. But the thing is that then it was, like I say, sort of like a single node, a single hub that you would try and attract people to. And then as social networks came in, although we didn't really think of this at the time, we kind of seeded, power is the wrong word, but we sort of seeded that hub effect to these third party sites, right?
Uh-huh.
Which we didn't think was a problem at the time. maybe didn't actually work out so great. But the point was is that then you were like, okay, we'll have a Facebook page, we'll have an X account, or sorry, a Twitter account. We'll have whatever,
A
MySpace
Reddit, a
actually for a while.
Discord, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
MySpace, yeah. Maybe
yeah.
Discord wasn't around yet, but yeah.
No, no. Although arguably it was called IRC. But so then as you start to do that, your community kind of becomes a network as opposed to a single point, right? You probably still have a website. You might even still have forums, but you become this network effect. And then it becomes more about, from a management perspective, how you decide you want to meet that community. And I say meet in the sense of communicate with them, right? So whatever touch points you or they think are relevant or important, those are the ones you have to go after, right? And that really does vary, certainly by industry, but often by product, right? There's no one size fits all, community management strategy, even in gaming. I mean, yeah, a lot of gaming companies have Discords, and a Discord is kind of the thing now, but it's not the only thing. And it doesn't have to be the only thing. Um, I could do half an hour on Discord, but the very short version is, the real issue with Discord is it's very difficult to be found, right? Yes, of course, you direct them from your official website, right? But discoverable servers on Discord are kind of an afterthought, right?
Yeah.
And also, because it's a closed system, you have no search use, for lack of a better word, although that itself is changing because of AI search. But what that means is back in the day, and by that, not even 5 years ago, if you had a website and you had forums or you had any kind of presence, it was going to be indexed by Google, right? So if I
Yeah.
then go looking for X game community, I'm going to end up on one of the official spots, right? Now you might find the Discord in the search results, you might not, but that can be difficult. It's especially difficult when you're talking about deeper games with more um, just more mechanics or more history or whatever, right? Like it would be difficult for anyone to just drop into World of Warcraft today and know the entire game back to front, right? Clearly you can't do that. Like there's, dozens and dozens of systems and, decades of lore and expansions and stuff by this point, right? But if you drop into that community, the question that they as a team will face is very different than this question that, say, some indie studio who's trying to put together their own Discord is facing, right? The principles are the same, but the actual things you have to do are pretty damn different.
I think what I also find fascinating is the fragmentation of these communities now. Because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we stick to the WoW example, you have like 4 different game modes. So you have retail,
Mm,
you have
mm,
season of discovery, you have classic, you have hardcore. But then
yeah.
on top of that, if you think of kind of the streamer kind of generation that we're in,
Mm-hmm.
where now these streamers have their own micro communities. So you might be watching a Zaryu or
Right.
an Asmongold, and then they have their own sub communities where they may be focused on that game or on many different types of games, and then
Mm-hmm.
the communities kind of follow them. And so you
Yeah.
see kind of this up and down, like these spikes of interest that go through the player base, because rather than following the game, they follow the influencer that plays the
Mm.
game. And so you have these
That's
pockets now.
that's interesting because it's very analogous to the way the guilds used to function. I mean, guilds still do function this way, but there was a period of time where guilds were very, very influential on MMOs in particular, right? Part of the reason is that MMOs were frankly a lot smaller, right? Like I don't know how many players Fortnite has now, but it's probably 50 million or more easily, right? At peak, no, not at peak, that's not fair, but like in the early days of World of Warcraft, when it hit 1 million players, everyone was like, "That's what?"
It's
Right?
incredible. Yeah.
When EverQuest hit 100,000 players, everyone was completely blown away. So um, at that sort of scale, at that million size scale, and even a little bit above that, guilds were a big deal because if guilds brought in 400-500 players, then that was a big deal. And I don't mean in terms of revenue or whatever else. It was really more the network effect, right?
Yeah.
Because it would be like, oh, important guild A, who used to do a lot of EverQuest raiding, has just gone to World of Warcraft. We should check that out, right? That's the thinking. The thing about influencers is obviously it's a different scale, right? So, the biggest influencers with their community, yeah, they'll actually move the needle potentially in terms of the number of people who will, flood into a game. The difference now is that a lot of those games, especially at least the bigger ones, it doesn't really make a difference, right? Even if 1 million people start playing Call of Duty tomorrow that didn't play it the day before, they won't really, they'll see it, but they won't really, be surprised. Having said that, the really interesting thing about influencers is where they intersect with smaller games and particularly indie games, right? Influencers can make or break indie games, maybe not break, but you know, if they pay attention to them, potentially that leads them to a lot of success. Um, and yeah, it is either just because the community is playing it, or it just got out to a wider audience, and people heard about it that way. Which is of course you know, I don't know what's the best metaphor, light years, 1,000 years. It's a long way away from the way game journalism used to be, right? Even again, a few years back, right? Like, I mean, IGN and people like that still exist, but I don't know about you, but I don't
No,
look at
it
those
doesn't have the
sites
same clout anymore.
anymore.
No.
And I certainly don't go, oh my God, they gave so and so a 9. Like, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
It's a completely different way of navigating through that system now.
Yeah. I try to imagine. I'm a big fan of Reddit. I think Reddit works
Hmm.
really well from as a PM, as someone who looks into my own game. I can get a lot of feedback on Reddit, and you get this upvote system where you get the
Hmm.
best comments coming up, and it's an incredible form of research if you can manage it properly and kind of. I don't want to say PR, but you got to be careful how you write to players. But
Oh,
if you
100%.
interact,
And Reddit
if you
in
interact with them
particular,
and
yeah.
like, yeah, but if you interacting with them in a proper way, um, it's an incredible tool to connect with your audience, to understand what players are thinking. I think people tend to think that the community can be quite toxic, but in my experience, if you interact in the right way, it is a gold mine of information that players will tell you.
Sure.
Um,
Even the toxicity, if it is directed towards a game, it's worth paying attention to,
yeah,
right? Unless it's completely ridiculous, like, oh, you changed the color of this character's hair to pink and I hate it, right? Like, okay, cool. I mean, I get that is feedback, but is it really worth acting on? I don't know. That's down to, your execs. But if they're all pissed off because you just changed I don't know, the DPS of a class, or you nerfed, I mean, the classic MMO, you nerfed, you buffed, right?
yeah,
That's what drives pretty much all the conversation. Um, those things are worth, digging into, right? I mean, quite frankly, when I was managing forums of any kind, you pay a lot more attention to the threads where people are complaining, because obviously if they complain, they may stop playing the game, and you don't want that, right? So that's usually where you're going to concentrate your intent, your interest. And also, like, there are some people who used to say that, like, forums are only inhabited by the 10% of the player base who are really upset or vocal or whatever, right? Which is
yeah,
true, right? Like, you never have a forum which has every single member, every single registered person playing your game, but 10% often represents a much higher percentage, of the actual player base who don't go to the forums, who can't be bothered to post, who just don't see the point in, going on Reddit, right? They're either the people who will upvote those Reddit posts but don't say anything, or they're the ones in forums who are lurking and looking at threads but aren't posting, but they exist, right? So, like, anyone who says, like, well, forums are just full of crazy people who'd like to post, it's like,
no,
absolutely not. They
no
are.
way.
There's always a portion. Again, it's always about proportion. But, like, yes, there are a tiny, small number of people who, we used to sort of joke about people who play the forum game, who get so deeply into the community that they start. It looks like they're posting more on the forum than they are playing the game, right? And that's just a human psychology thing. And yes, those people, you don't treat them less seriously, but you understand that they're invested in the community almost as much as the game itself, right? Um, but that you learn over time. But yeah, 100%. Like, quite frankly, like, when I started in community, my kind of mantra, which I fully stole, I will admit, uh, was, customers want to speak to companies, so companies should speak to their customers. That's simple, right?
Yeah,
If you're not engaged in that conversation with your customer base, then unless you have the world's best instincts, or you're, Steve Jobs, and you can, like, magically create things that people want to use, then you're screwed. Like, sooner or later, you're going to go down, right? Um, and I don't think there are actually many companies that have any level of success that don't listen to their community to some degree. They just might not formalize it, right? You're not a PM, but you spend time in Reddit and things like that, right? So you're soaking up feedback, willingly. And I'm sure there are many other people in your company who are not in that formal function who do the same thing, right? The question is only, how does the company deal with that feedback, and how do they decide to implement it, and what becomes important and what is seen as less important, which is all just priorities and, competing demands and technical stuff and money. And, there's 100 factors that goes into those decisions as well.
Because it's an incredible double-edged sword. Like, I think even almost supercharged nowadays, where if you do a great update, you're going to hear about it, you're going to see it, it's going to create its own news. Like, it's
Yeah,
gonna go through the
totally.
site. You're
Yeah.
going to have loads of people posting. It'll go across all the different media platforms and websites, blah, blah, blah. But on the flip side, if
Oh,
something
yeah.
bad happens,
Yeah.
your Reddit feed will just be flooded. And not only that, it amplifies the
Of
negativity. It can
course.
amplify the
Yeah.
positivity. And I think that's why people are kind of afraid of it. They see there's a great power to it, but there's also a great fear of trying to tiptoe around it. And in that tiptoeing, I think sometimes there's a loss of genuinity. Like, it doesn't feel as genuine. Like, I think people want
Authenticity.
authenticity. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. People want an authentic kind of communication with their game.
Yes.
Yet there is also a big fear where the mob mentality can come out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden it can tank the perspective of your game. A lot of
Yeah.
games suffer, like you mentioned, the indie games. Like, they can struggle really bad if the wrong influencer, maybe not the wrong influencer, but an influencer plays the game, doesn't really like it, maybe gives it half a shake, doesn't doesn't
Yeah.
really give it a fair shake. And then all of a sudden, you lose so much momentum where
Hmm.
maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, your game could have come out and it could have done twice as well, but simply because it didn't have that exposure.
Yeah. Everything, I mean, everything is connected, everything is networked, right? So, to your point about a good or a bad update, um, yeah, that's a classic example. Like, oh, you did this thing, now everybody's pissed off, and now it makes headlines. Part of the problem is, of course, we have this extremely algorithmic driven, kind of
Yeah.
media ecosystem, for lack of a better term, right? So outrage and high emotion drive traffic, drive clicks, right? So when something goes wrong, when players are pissed off, when they're doing whatever they're doing, then yeah, it bubbles up and it becomes a big thing. The question there from a studio's perspective or a publisher's perspective is like, well, what are you going to do to address that, right? And sometimes those decisions are they are literally just, oh, we goofed, we did a bad patch, like we shouldn't have nerfed that class, right? Whatever it is, that kind of thing. Assuming the studio understands that, agrees, or at least decides, what, the players are right. Okay, fine. Then it's really just a question of managing expectations. And to be honest, that should be done at the patch as opposed to the post patch. But sometimes you miss it, right? Sometimes you don't realize that, like, oh, we accidentally did this, or patch notes are the bane of a community manager's life in any kind of live game, because you are basically charged with getting every single change that has been made in a gigantic game system, and then telling the players about it in ways that understand, right? And your nightmare is that some designer changed something, didn't put it down in the system that you're using to record patch notes, and then it went live, and actually it's a big deal, right? And I don't mean bugs, I mean, although they're bad too, but I mean, some change somewhere that the community manager didn't know about, and now they're screaming from the rooftops, oh, you nerfed X or you did Y. And that's when you have to scramble to be like, what do we do? Why wasn't it in the patch notes? All right, what do I tell them? Are we rolling this back? What are we doing? you know. So yeah, but that's a Wednesday. But the I see what you're saying in terms of the problem these days is we have entered this kind of supercharged, polarized environment, right? Um, where partially things that frankly shouldn't merit any kind of anger, provoke anger, although sometimes it's anger, inverted quotes, angry for the sake of being angry. But that is understandable, in terms of wanting to be careful. But from my perspective, and I don't say this, because I work in this sphere, that is exactly why you need professional people on your staff. They don't have to necessarily even be CMs. Like, again, the small indie studio, not a problem, but um, you are going to have to pull double duty in communicating with customers and explain to them what's going on, and you do have to listen and you do have to pay attention, right? And there is a certain point where the time spent paying attention and communicating becomes a full-time job. And at that point, it's like, yeah, you need a community person, right? You need somebody to come in and actually monitor this stuff, understand what's happening, synthesize it, pass it back to developers, and then hopefully continue this virtuous cycle, right? Like, make change, community embraces or doesn't embrace change, feedback, make change, right? And on you go, right?
Because it is a bit of a crazy concept, the community, right? Because if
Oh
we
yeah.
say 10% of players are the most vocal, or the ones that are on Reddit or
Mhm.
Discord and they're communicating, that's only 10% of the players. Like the 90% that maybe are just playing passively or playing other games, they may view the content, they may do an upvote or maybe
But
react to it in some way. Yeah,
I'm sure you know that the other part of the job, which doesn't get talked about as much, is metrics, right? It's internal analytics and metrics.
sentiment.
So, yeah. So sometimes it's sentiment analysis, but a lot of the time it's literally what is happening in the game, right? So the classic community situation is, a patch goes out, a certain portion of the community is up in arms, and then I go to, whoever is responsible for looking at in-game metrics, and I go, is everybody really pissed off about XYZ, right? Because they'll say something like, "Oh, everybody hates this, nobody's playing it," and then you look at it and you're like, "No, actually, everybody's playing it, and it's totally fine." Right? And to be honest, that's a good day for a community person, because you can go back and go, I've seen the internal metrics. I hate to tell you this, but you're wrong. Like, I understand you don't like it, and that's still valid feedback, and it is still something you want to pass over, but the numbers don't lie, right? Is the simple truth. Now, of course, the problem is that not everyone builds their games in that fashion, right? Again, smaller studios don't have the time, don't think it's going to be something that they really need to worry about. Although I think, especially with modern game engines, there's probably a certain amount of analytics built in anyway. But those are the crucial things. That's your 90%, right? That's the people who aren't talking. They're just playing, and how they play is obviously crucial, and looking at that and making those determinations. It has to be done with both things, you know. And there's, of course, the rare times when you are forced by circumstances, usually business related, to do some sort of an update or some sort of a change that you potentially know is going to annoy the players, but you have to do it anyway. And then that's just a question of, communication and everything else. Um, but it's pretty rare that there's a small part of the player base who's really pissed off about something who are genuinely right. It does happen, um, but it's rare because most of the time, to get that kind of level of vocal outrage, you just need a certain, critical mass. Although these days, bots and all this kind of craziness, in theory, you could do more than that, but then that sort of raises it up to the level of like, why would someone want to make that kind of an effort? Um, and yeah, there are reasons, but it's just part of the ever growing kind of task list you have as a community person, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to figure out whether we're being brigaded by bots right now. Okay, cool. you know um but yeah, that's it.
So you mentioned bots, which you've piqued my interest. What do you mean by bots in community? Because are they? I know we'll reach one day where you can have AI bots that are using LLMs and they can
I don't even want
post.
to think about that, but
That's a scary thing, right? Well, we can address that because I'd
and
love
it
to
ain't
chat
very
about
far
that. Because
away
it's
either. But I mean mostly from social media perspectives, right? Like, places like X in particular are fairly vulnerable to this sort of thing, right? Like, they literally are botnets that you can get
yeah,
access to out there, and you program them to go in there and whatever you want it to say, it says, right? Like, oh, we'll hate this update or whatever it happens to be. I think honestly that is not as prevalent in gaming. Gaming still tends to be a bit more like organized anger, like you talk about influencers as an example, right? Like, an influencer can go out and say, we should all go, I don't know, review bomb this game, right? Meaning, deliberately leave bad reviews to tank ratings, especially on Steam. And that is a thing, and that can happen. And I mean, that's one of the reasons that Steam changed the way that their review stuff works a few years back, because they realized that this was happening too often. And understandably, from the point of view of publishers and developers, they were like, this isn't very fair. Like, we have a really negative rating, but it's only because a bunch of people came in the last 30 days and said bad things about us, right? So a lot of the time, that's what you hope, is that the tech will advance and keep up with it. But bots in particular are going to be problematic. And I mean, in theory, although again, I'm kind of like, why would you make the effort? But some people will. In theory, yeah, you could end up with AI agents that are posting on your forums or posting on social media or whatever. Yeah, there's always going to be someone who does that kind of stuff. Um, and unfortunately, from the point of view of a community person, it's like, well, it's part of my job to try to keep up with what they're doing out there and then adjust, you know, appropriately, right? It's not great from the point of view of being the manager who has had those conversations with people who are like, well, it's only 10% of our players, you know. And now it's like, well, it's only bots. It's like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, you know. But I mean, at the core, a community manager is a player as well, right? Like, they
yeah.
should know before a patch or change is even made in the game. They should be aware, and they should be able to say, this is going to be a problem. Like, people are not going to like this. Um, or people will love this, right? That's a crucial part of what you're doing. So you should have some awareness fairly early on, like, the way that wind is potentially blowing. I mean, that's obviously more and more difficult the bigger and bigger your game project is, but that's the job. I mean, yeah.
What would you say makes a healthy community? And I bring this up because I've noticed whenever I've looked at feedback on X or
Mm,
Twitter, it is so incredibly toxic compared to
yes.
maybe Reddit, where it can have certain elements of toxicity, but by and large, even Reddit and Discord, I think players are more there to share their love of the game or to share their thoughts on it. But X just seems to be this breeding ground of toxicity. And I never can understand, like I've also asked, like just why are we even using X? Because to me, it
That's a
just
valid
feels like
question. Yeah.
there's this mob mentality that goes on there. And I think this just relates to, again, the wider question, which is what makes a healthy community? And is it just your choice in platform, or is it the way you interact with players, being consistent, being open, or how would you see it?
I think there's a little difference here between a healthy community and a community that's functioning correctly. And what I mean by that is a healthy community really is, are they playing the game? Are they enjoying it? Are they leaving positive reviews? Yes, yes, yes. Everything's fine, right? It's pretty rare that you have a community that's negative and crappy if all of those things are happening, right? Because they wouldn't be playing if they weren't happy at some level, right? Um, Now, how do you best manage a community and how do you put it in a space where it can be functional and useful to you is a very critical question. And you just mentioned, an obvious issue. Um, Quite frankly, I think social networks as a place to gather useful feedback have become increasingly, pointless, to be honest. For every one comment you get, which is actually useful, you can easily get 10 or 20 or 50 that are, you know, not helpful at all. Um, and you do have to make those kind of decisions of like, do we want to be on this platform? Right now, it used to be, of course, that it was like, well, you have to be on all of them because you're like, we want to reach our audience and they're all on these different places and we must do this. But that was, I mean, that is really 2011, 12 thinking. Like that was when those social networks were so relatively new that you did still get like organic reach and all that other kind of thing, right? But for Facebook from 2017 onwards, you were done. Like your organic reach was in the 1 to 2% range, and if it was, you were doing really well, right? Um, so it became increasingly a algorithm driven, and then the underlying part of that being, of course, ad driven, right? Like oh, you can pay money to boost your posts and reach more people, right? So at that point, you have to make this decision of like, well, why are we here, right? A lot of legacy projects obviously have things like Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, or whatever it happens to be. And if you come in and inherit one of them, then yeah, you probably are going to be expected to keep, using it, right? And if there's life in those platforms, then they're worth keeping on. But if I was starting something from scratch today, and the question is like, okay, what should we roll out, right?
Yeah.
Um, it really does come down to the game itself and then the community you want to reach, right? Discord is the reflex action, right? Everyone's kind of like, well, we have to have a Discord, right? It's like, well, okay, good, but how are you going to build it, right? Because as you know, Discord has a bajillion bots, and even with the normal, server stuff, there's a ton of different ways that you can lay that out and set that up, right? So there's no one size fits all. There's no, particular way to do it. Um, and then, there's many other choices, right? The reason Discord is good is that it does fill a number of different functions, right? It gives you immediate real-time chat, voice chat, if you want to support it in your server. And then obviously it can support, sort of forums, although I don't think their forums are great. It's also a place you can share media and all that kind of stuff. So all of these things are good, right? Um, so as a sort of off-the-shelf solution that will probably work, yeah, it's totally fine. Um, Now, talking about community health, from there, it's really just a question of like, how active is it, right? Like, how busy is it? How are people talking? Are they interested in talking? You know, which is it's a job in and of itself, right? And that, making that happen spans a whole bunch of different stuff from the simplest of, hey, can we make sure that the Discord is linked to from the main menu on the game or, at the bottom of the website or whatever, right? All the way through to making sure that, you have moderation in place, you have, regular updates, that your community manager or whoever they are in there talking to people, all that kind of stuff needs to happen for that, to be successful. But really, ultimately, for me, like I say, the health of a community, is a community healthy? One, it's going to be, are they playing the game, etc. And the other is there a functioning feedback loop? Meaning, if players do or don't like something, and then the community manager, or even if you don't have that, the studio, just say the studio is an entity including community, if they react to that and make changes and then that continues, that's healthy, right? The healthy cycle should be them saying whether they like something or don't like something, and then the studio acting on that, and you know, on you go.
You know what it is? It's when you're on Reddit, when you're on X, when you're on these different platforms, you're casting a very wide net.
Hmm.
And you're going to be picking up players who kind of play, players who really play, players who don't play, players who've tried it but are just kind of they followed or that's in their algorithm, or maybe players who've are just in the outskirts of that game, or maybe it's just popped up again in their algorithm. For me, I kind of think when I try to think the future of community, you want to reach out to the fans. You want to reach out to the players who play your game, and potentially even the super fans.
Hmm.
And I think we both come from like an MMORPG background with Star Wars: The Old Republic on your end, and old school RuneScape on mine. And I keep thinking, wouldn't the future of community be being able to pick up feedback within the game? Now, maybe certain games are limited in doing that, but don't you want to collect it directly from the source rather than casting this huge net in these online forums or these spaces where anyone can really say anything, and where one bad actor can influence, I think, what are genuine comments about the state of the game or their thoughts and beliefs. So it goes back to even when I reference health, I always think, even in real life, wouldn't you want to connect directly with the people who play rather than kind of throw it out to everyone? And
Yeah,
not to
yeah.
say that you don't want to listen to everyone's feedback, but as a community manager, as a game studio, you really want to listen to the people that play your game more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, you know, community people will spend a lot of time trying to identify those people that you call, fans, super fans, whatever, right? And some people will formalize it. I've done it in the past with like ambassador programs, fan site programs, guild programs,
Yeah.
so that you actually end up in like direct conversation with them. I've been in, company organized focus groups, right? Where we'll show people stuff and we'll listen to them talking about it, or we'll record them talking about it, or we'll play directly with them and just ask them questions about stuff. You did hit on something interesting though, which strikes me, which is that especially in MMOs, whether it's communicating by text or now voice, there's an opportunity to potentially look at analyzing sentiment using AI with those things. It's not going to be necessarily easy, but it is potentially doable. You could take, general chat and then dump it into an AI that has been trained to understand what the hell it's looking at, and then extract usable information out of that in theory, right? That would have to be used in concert with the metrics side as well, right? Like,
Yeah.
but you put those two things together and, potentially they put me out of a job. Uh, but at the same time, no one ever sits in, a community manager on average is not going to sit in general chat all day long and read it, and nor are they going to ask for chat logs and then, try and skim through them, right? Because you haven't got that kind of time. And also, a lot of the time that chat is not in depth, right? It's just like, I'm going here, I need this, I need that, right?
Yeah, there's
But
a nuance.
yeah, but that's why something like an AI in that situation is really handy, because you can be like, okay, just ignore all the stuff where they're talking about trading or like I'm looking for a group or whatever, and focus in, just on the feedback. There's a place for AI in, straight up sentiment analysis too, although I've yet to see an absolute killer piece of software that does it 100% of the time. I mean, I've not even joking. I have been pitched by companies for probably 10, 12 years in different roles where they're like, we have this sentiment analysis tool. It's brilliant. It's going to be amazing. And then when you plug it in, it doesn't understand gamer speak. Like it just goes, what? Is this negative? I don't know. Maybe, so either you end up spending a lot of time training it, or you just throw it out the window and go, well, that was useful. But these days, LLMs are trained with enough data that they can actually go in there and usually make a pretty good, analysis to say, yeah, people are positive, people are negative. Um, but you still have to get down to the level of like, I need to see the comment, I need to see the actual, written detail, right? Any community manager who's done this for a while, you sort of gain the ability to go through feedback, whether it's like forum threads or it's Discord chat or it's comments on some social network. you gain the ability pretty quickly to go through that stuff and go, they're happy, they're unhappy, they're pissed off. These are the the things that are obvious trends, and that's just from basically skimming it, right? It's not particularly difficult to do, really. It's just kind of reading a lot and then synthesizing it in your head. The tricky part is often figuring out why it is that they're annoyed, because they're not always telling you directly, and that's not because they're hiding it, but they might be telling you something like the game isn't as fun as it used to be, right? So then the question is, well, why, right? And one obvious way to get into that is to have those direct one-on-one conversations with people, but the other is, to try and look at it and go, okay, well, in actual fact, this is because this person is this kind of player, and we've changed the game in this way. So, no wonder they're not, happy about it anymore, right?
I think
Um, yeah.
that's kind of what I'm leaning on is that I know you talk about AI, and I have to push back on the idea that I think AI will replace community managers, because
Oh,
I
I think
believe the
some people
level of
would love it to replace community managers,
I'm
but
sure that
yeah,
there are some studios, but to me, just working with so many great CMs, I've been really fortunate to work with some great community management teams, and just the level of nuance that you need to understand who these
yeah,
players are, what their play styles are, the narrative history of the game, and just kind of the ebbs and flows of how the game has evolved. I think there's a lot there to just know intuitively that I don't think an
yeah,
AI can pick up, even if it's trained on the best data.
yeah.
But I think as a product person, as someone who has done a lot of research, I also highly believe in like one-to-one interviews. And something I've
Mm,
noticed in gaming, I think in the industry at large, I think we're very good at putting in data pipelines. We're very good at being able to just use quantitative metrics to observe behavior, but we struggle with the qualitative. We don't have focus groups of players, at least from my experience, and I haven't had as long a career as you, but I'm just hoping that maybe the industry can evolve to the sense that we can pick out players and just have conversations with them, and dig deep into what their problems are
mm,
with the game, and understand them more at a deeper level. Because I think looking at everything in an aggregate all the time, looking at everything as who's upvoting the most, or what's the top comment,
mm.
or where's the hour, I think a lot of assumptions get built there, and without those CMs to kind of drive through those assumptions, I think mistakes are very easy to make, and
I would say that a lot of what you're talking about does happen. It just isn't visible. And I don't mean that as in, very few companies are ever going to go out and say, yeah, we had focus groups, right? Like, they're not going to
yeah.
boast about it. A good CM is talking to those super fans, those really deep embedded players who've been around the block a lot and know the game and really like the game. Of course, you have to go in there and go, well, this person has been playing for 5 years, but they're always upset, right? They're always angry, right? You get that kind of player, but then there's the other kind of player who's more reasoned, more, it's often the person you want is often the less vocal person, right?
Hmm.
Who, not because they're happier or anything else, but because they often have pretty great opinions, but they don't have those opinions shaped by community thinking or whatever. But the truth is, you need a balance, right? You need a bit of each, right? So in MMOs, very traditionally, we would do things on forums like what do we call them? Like class representatives, right? So it would be like, oh, you're the people who represent the Jedi Knight, right? And
Yeah.
you can get into very deep sort of formal ways of doing things. Some companies have done things like player councils and stuff with voting and the whole 9 yards, which is completely legitimate. Um, that's useful just in terms of like, putting that onus back on the players. It's like, okay, you say that you're someone who loves playing this class. And by you, I usually mean a group of people. We're looking to you to talk to your people in the sense of your sub community, and then come back to us and give us, that feedback. You, of course, need to still back that up with metrics and also with just looking at that stuff, and reading it to make sure that what they're telling you is not their own personal opinions. Um, and then, that kind of stacks up into, okay, these guys are unhappy about this, these guys are happy about that, and then the general population thinks this and this and this. Um, and then it's just a question of ranking, what's the most important thing. But those focus groups do happen. They're often just, kind of behind closed doors,
Yeah.
or they're just happening in like DMs and private conversations between the CM or the CM team and various different players and, different people. I mean, I used to really like just going when I went to shows, just talking with people about the game, right?
Yeah.
Apart from the fact that 99 times out of 100, they're way more positive in real life than they are on the forums. You would also just get really deep into, what they like, what they dislike, you know, um, and, whatever their preferences are or thoughts for the future of the game or, whatever it happens to be. But yeah, it does happen. It's ultimately, it's always a balance, right? You do need those aggregate numbers. You definitely need those metrics. You do have to be careful. I think that the thing you're kind of getting at is that idea of like, oh, we've had 300 negative comments on X in the last hour, then, the patch is a disaster or everybody hates us, right? Or even, things like review bombing and stuff. Sometimes you do have to take that with a pinch of salt because it's coordinated action or it's just everybody just really, losing their minds for a day or two, right?
But I think it's
Um,
the medium that's limiting, though. I think like when it's just
oh,
lots
agreed.
of
Yeah.
threads or comments, I think the ability to be able to jump in and just talk to a player and maybe um, broadcast it in some way. Like I've found that when I'm speaking to players on Reddit, if you're very honest and open about the work
Hmm.
that's happening and the difficulty of building either a live service game or an indie game or
Oh, yeah.
whatever that
Yeah. Yeah.
context may be, players are incredibly understanding because a lot of them just look up to the very fact of building games. Like they think it's an amazing thing that you're doing. And as soon as you call out, hey, we're just a team, we're trying to figure this out, we're doing the best we can for you. Here are the problems that we're encountering. Here are the difficulties we've had as
Yeah.
a team. And usually people will kind of not mention that stuff. It's like, oh, let's not tell them. But in my experience, the more transparent and open you are about just the difficulties of building a game, about kind of the complexities of things that have been happening behind the scenes, players love that. They love that idea that you're like bringing them into your world and
Hmm.
just opening it up rather than making it a secret operation that I think from the eyes of many players just see it as some capitalist cash grab, right? But it's not. It's great people wanting to make great
Well,
games
sometimes it
for
is, but
sometimes
yeah,
I see things sometimes in a very maybe you could
but
call it
those
naive, but
times,
I'm an idealist.
yeah, those companies are pretty obvious in what they're trying to do. I mean, it goes back to what you said earlier about authenticity, and I didn't really follow up on it. Like
Yeah.
I mentioned that my mantra still is, companies should talk to players or customers or whatever. But the other thing I often say is like my, community ethos, I suppose, is to be transparent and honest until it hurts. And the hurts line varies from not even just company to company, but also incident to incident. The sort of half joking example I always say is like if the servers went down for 8 hours and the reason why was because, one of the guys in the server room tripped over and pulled the cable out the wall. I wouldn't necessarily tell players that, right? Because it just makes the company look stupid, right?
Mhm.
Like it makes you look incompetent. But if what you're saying, if it's a patch, if it's a technical issue that could not be helped, then yeah, absolutely, being as authentic as possible is and as transparent as possible is very important. And companies vary in their embrace of that, partly because of the simple fact that a lot of companies are publicly traded, so there is a financial aspect to it. There's actually some legal aspects to that as well,
Yeah, to keep it
but
steady.
there's a certain amount that you cannot disclose. But generally speaking, exactly as you say, is like, reframing the conversation to be like, you understand that the person you're screaming invective at is actually a human being with, a job and, whatever. Um, and some players don't even care about that. But yeah, most of the time they'll absolutely, accept what you're doing. Of course, the key is that you have to then back that up with action, right? Whether it's like, okay, we are going to revert the changes that we made, or you get the servers up as fast as you can. Um, you have to do those things, which is why the community manager can't be out there making promises or writing checks that their mouth can't
Yeah.
cash, right? Like the studio has to be behind them and in agreement, and that is a lot easier when either the CM or the CM team are very well embedded and respected by the studio, or the studio is just smaller, right? Like when it's smaller and you're all in it together and everyone's working in concert, then it's much more likely that you're going to be, authentic and transparent, right?
Yeah.
Now, there are absolute drawbacks to, authenticity and transparency, right? Not just the obvious thing of, oh dear, this particular dev uh, got upset or got trolled or, whatever, and then they shut their mouth off on social media or on a forum or whatever and was basically like, you all suck and I hate you all. And, that's your headline, right? Um, Again, good reason to have a CM team, right? Who are not going to lose their heads and they're going to, keep calm in public, right? That doesn't mean that they can't be impassioned. That doesn't mean that they can't be honest, but they're not going to come out and say, well, you know what, you all suck and you're all idiots, right? Because they're professionals. Um, that doesn't usually happen from developers elsewhere in the studio, but it can, right? Sometimes that's just the case, right? So there is a fine line, that you've got to walk. But yeah, generally speaking, I'm all for being as transparent as possible. And I've been in companies that have been very transparent and others that have not been. And there's different strategies for each. And sometimes the lack of transparency is because of the size of the company or the publicly traded thing, or it might just be sometimes, frankly, the difficult part of the job is when you're having to relay news that you've been told to relay, and the reasoning behind that you fundamentally disagree with. But unfortunately, your job is just to, you know, explain to people as best you can. And for me, when that happens, I'm usually digging to be like, I really need to understand this, and sometimes it does just come down to we're a business, we need to earn money, or you know, or we need to save money, right? Um, which I've actually told people sometimes in the past, right? Because sometimes players are just like, I don't get it, and ultimately I'll just be like, we are a business. This is a commercial enterprise. I hate to remind you, but which is tough to remind people sometimes, right? Like, because it's kind of a break with reality in a strange way, especially if they're playing an MMO or something where they've devoted potentially years of their life to, you know, sort of pulling them out and going, just have to remind you, this is actually a company that needs to
We are
survive and
for
pay
profit. Yeah.
employees and, do everything else, right? Um, it means that, yeah, sometimes the thing you love will go away or will be changed in ways that you don't like, and sometimes that's it. That's the end of the romance, essentially, right? Like, that does happen. Um, but yeah.
Wouldn't you say though that players? This is something I've noticed. Players nowadays are way more understanding of the business side of games. Like you see people on Reddit when they're talking about games, they're like, "Well, this is the owner, this is the CEO, this is the the corporate structure," and they're kind of diving into LinkedIn and they're trying to understand where the funding is, and they're trying to
Yeah.
like look at like nowadays. I think back in the day, I think there was a bit of this the curtain wasn't drawn in terms of what happened behind it. I think maybe people kind of just assumed,
Yeah.
it's a game. So nowadays, players are just even way more tuned in. You see it like the noise that was made by EA getting bought by the
Mm.
PIF and Silver Lake for a record amount, 55 billion. Everyone's analyzing it. Everyone's breaking it down. You have like the streamers that are talking about it with their players, having these conversations, almost as if like if you're a CM today, you have to hold your own against an army of players that now
Oh
kind
yeah.
of basically understand the business in a lot of ways, and
Yeah.
it's I
I
feel
mean,
for the yeah
speaking personally around that kind of thing in particular, that in very specific. If I was just, for argument's sake, I'm a CM on one of many EA franchises,
yeah
and I'm dealing with a community that's like, what's going to happen now that you've been bought by this company, right? The simple answer is you don't know, right? You've got no way of knowing. But then if it got into things like, don't you think it's terrible, the human rights record of the people behind the money, that it's like, again, not even a question of like way above my pay grade. It's like that's so far away from the
yeah
reality of what's going to happen with this franchise. Um, you're right in that people are more understanding of the business stuff, but I would also say they're not more understanding of the stuff, right? Like they can go in and go, oh, okay, so the PIF is this fund and it's owned by these people, blah, 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 and Silver Lake is run by these guys and so on and so forth. You can get all that information, but you weren't in the room when the deal was made, right? You don't know why they may or may not be buying, the thing. You'd assume it's because they think it's going to go well, right? But for example, you probably remember Embracer as a group was relying on the same guys for something like a $4 billion, I think, line of credit or something, and
yeah
they backed out of the deal, right? And that was kind of a devastating blow for Embracer, and it rippled across the industry and put a lot of people out of work. But do we know why that happened? No, we don't know, right? So players can speculate and digest and dissect this stuff up to a point, but there's always going to be a point at which they don't know. And frankly, the CM is very unlikely to know too, right? Like, no one at the CM level in EA is privy to whatever the hell happened in the boardroom, when they made those acquisition talks, right? all they know is, okay, we're owned by somebody else now, and they're just probably hoping that they hold on to a job, right?
Yeah.
Because it will have, probably significant effects on the company at least, and maybe the industry beyond that.
I have to ask then. I wanna pivot a little bit, or maybe just go back to what we were discussing earlier. But when I was young and I was playing World of Warcraft, I think one of the most amazing things was encountering a GM in game. That was
Hmm.
one of the coolest things ever. You had this GM that could like create, could levitate above ground, spawn huge demons, like just
Yeah.
talk to the players, like they were almost like these gods that descended upon the game. And
Hmm.
I always question why Blizzard. I question. I understand why. It's always like a financial reason why they don't want to afford more GMs. But
Hmm.
I still think to this day that it was not worth the cut, because I think the value that GMs bring to a game, the ability for people to jump in, speak to players directly. Um,
So you
I think
understand
even
what
sorry, go on.
GMs are or were, right?
Well, tell me.
They're customer service agents. I mean, they're usually higher tier agents because, GMs usually have powers in game that they don't necessarily want to give to low level employees. But that's 9 times out of 10, that's exactly who they are. They're customer service agents. And they're usually in the game because they have to do something that has to happen in game, right? Some companies are good in that they allow, you to do back end changes from some sort of interface, which is way more effective as a way to do it, right? But there have certainly been plenty of examples of games where, well, the only way for me to get, gold back into this guy's inventory is for me to go in as a GM character, load my character with a ton of gold, and then gift it to them in game, right? Just for argument's sake.
Yeah,
That's a horribly ineffective way of doing that, but it might be the only way to do it. Um, there's certainly been examples of smaller games, particularly during betas, and I've been in these scenarios myself, where you might do in-game events and then run around and do stuff and have fun. And you hit the nail on the head. It is cost, unfortunately. The simple truth is, it just doesn't scale, and I really wish it did. But the truth is that if you really wanted to do it properly, you would have to have an army of people, and you would probably have to charge an arm and a leg. And to be honest, it's actually surprising that no one has had this idea. And I mean, in like, Sony, or I don't even know who owns EverQuest now, but whoever still owns EverQuest, and then things like World of Warcraft. I mean, you mentioned like the different World of Warcraft modes and stuff. Why not have a GM run, kind of little slice of world? But you'd have to charge probably $100 or $200 a month in subs, but it would pay for those, additional people and that additional manpower. People kind of, it's easy to forget that World of Warcraft, EverQuest, and everything that, came from that, every single one of these things came from tabletop role playing games
yeah,
with some board game and wargaming influence, sprinkled in there, right? WoW and EverQuest are a direct, well, themselves are both descended from things like NetHack and roguelikes, but doesn't matter. But they are both directly attempts to recreate the experience of a DM or GM sitting across a table from players, or as it is more often now, probably on a Zoom call with other players, and playing a game where they are directly interacting and the GM is thinking this stuff up on the fly, right? So what you're missing is that experience, right? Which is the thing of like, well, anything can happen, right? This GM can do anything. They could spawn monsters or do whatever else. What's been interesting to see for me, particularly in games like Roblox in the last couple of years, they're starting to allow that kind of experience again, right? Where somebody can come in and be like the admin and they can do funky stuff in the game. And I've seen streamers do it and that kind of stuff. And yeah, there's a reason why it's popular. It's fun, right? When you bring the
yes,
human element into it, it's like, what's going to happen next? I don't really know, right? And that's the reason why D&D is still around after 50 years, right? And people still play it because that social and human side of it is kind of impossible to beat. I think the reason why we all enjoyed GMs, and I did too. I participated in end of beta events for games where we would go in as like you know major NPCs in the game and suddenly run around in their skins and have their powers, right? Which everybody loves because they're like, oh my God, this is the person who previously just stood there with an exclamation point, above their heads or whatever, and now they're running around and I can interact with them, right? An infamous example is poor Richard Garriott going into, I can't remember which Ultima, I guess it was probably Ultima Online, and they somehow managed to kill his character. And given that Lord British was supposed to basically kind of supposed to be God, that was a kind of amusing moment where like you didn't have your invincibility on, Richard. Um, but um, but yeah, that's the reason that we love this stuff. It's the reason that the why we remember it, and it's also the reason why a certain faction of players, particularly in MMOs and also just in multiplayer, don't want to do anything other than play multiplayer games because they feel like that playing against a human is infinitely better than playing against an AI of any kind. Um, Me personally, I don't really tend to play a lot of games that are like directly competitive. It's me versus a game system or whatever, right? Um, but obviously, if I'm going to play, I mean, with the exception of obviously the campaign type games, but I wouldn't really go into a Call of Duty or Battlefield or whatever and play a death match against a bunch of bots, right? Except as practice, right? That's just not going to be as much fun. So I think it just all really comes down to that. That's why GM events in MMOs were so popular. It was like, oh my God, suddenly it feels really, different. And it's also why for a long time it was kind of like a holy grail of MMO developers, which was like, oh, we're going to make something where the world is going to change in response to player actions. And some people have done that. Some projects have been relatively successful in that, but that's also an amazingly difficult technical challenge, which is why not many games do it.
I think you see it in. I started playing WoW Classic again in 2019,
Hmm.
and you could see like the streamers creating all these events in game, and I think
Sure.
even WoW Hardcore to a certain extent, I fell in love with Hardcore so much because I think that's the true embodiment of an MMO is when you have one life and everything matters, every potion, everything you pick up, and every podcast I have, I tend to talk about Hardcore. I'm just very passionate about it because I love the idea that everything is finite and you have to be careful, but when I try to connect the GM to the streamer, like you see Asmongold and the content that he's been able to create in WoW Classic, where he created all these guilds called Olympus, and then one of the guilds, the GM, the guild master quit, and then this random guy became the guild master. And all of a sudden, he's trying to get it back, and everyone's towering around in Stormwind, and you have
Right.
crowds of people, and that's the element that I think for a lot of game studios, for any game, if we're in an environment now where streamers pick up these events and broadcast them, and that is more valuable than any kind of marketing can buy. Like you go on YouTube front page, you follow gaming,
Sure.
you're
Yeah.
going to see that, and that's going to
Yeah.
hit millions of eyeballs.
Hmm.
Why wouldn't you invite people to come into your game and spice it up, change it, make the unpredictable, the unimaginable happen, rather than just a static world that kind of repeats itself over and over again? I know that there's an allure to that because people like playing something that they understand, that they can predict, but it's that magic. And so the reason I brought up the guild, the GM, who I
Hmm.
understand now was a customer rep going through the game, is because one day you log in and all of a
And the
sudden
game doesn't feel the way it did the day
you
before.
would have
Yeah.
never expected that, and you are just it's
I mean,
magical. And I think that
there are
it's a
absolutely
beautiful
games
thing.
that do that kind of thing. There's not many of them because they're really, really difficult to do. And there's also, there's a downside to it too, right? Like games, I think Conan Exiles does this, and I know that games like Eve, at least the original Eve and stuff, where they have like a full PvP world. But the problem is that you get negative behavior, right? Like you get people coming, if you allow that, depending on how hardcore you are, is like, okay, what do we allow? Do we allow player housing? Okay. Does player housing exist when the player isn't online? Okay. Can somebody come in and, steal all the shit out of their house? Can they destroy their house? What can they do? Right. The more that you ultimately reflect real life, or at least real life circumstances in this fantasy world, the more potential there is for negative stuff going on, right? It doesn't
Griefing,
happen
yeah.
in real life or even really in fictional worlds, right? Because there's obviously safeguards and things about that. But then that is an additional thing you have to now start thinking about as a game designer. It's like, okay, so do I have to put police in the game? All right, how do they work? Or guards or whatever it is? What are the consequences? And this is really interesting stuff to get into and explore. And there are still companies trying to do it. I'm blanking on the name, but the company that Rafe Costa is working with now, Star something. Anyway, Rafe, from the beginning of his career, has always been about player choice and emerging gameplay, even in things like Star Wars Galaxies. And there's certain players who love that, right? But then there's plenty of other people who are more like, no, I just want to go on the roller coaster, you know? Um, and that's often what we used to call it, right? Like, it's like it's the fairground ride experience versus, I don't know what the other one is, a LARP or something, or, like a rave. I don't know, but a free form experience that's dictated by those involved, right? But World of Warcraft proved it, right? Like, in fact, World of Warcraft proved two things. One, everybody loves the fairground of roller coaster experience. And two, most of them like to do it by themselves, right? Solo play in MMOs, I mean, it's right there in the name, massively multiplayer, right? But the majority of people would play World of Warcraft for the majority of the time by themselves. In fact, there's this moment when they get to a certain level, and it's kind of like, well, now you're kind of expected to go to raids and dungeons and stuff, and then you really have to be in a guild, right? And that's a very crucial moment because the player is either already in a guild or wants to get into a guild, or they just quit out, right? Um, but with WoW in particular, it wasn't a big deal because it was like, well, you can just go back and start with another character, another race, and if you enjoyed that mostly solo experience to that point, you'll go back and do it again, right? Um, that was very surprising to the industry as a whole. But I say that in a broader context, which is one of the reasons why you don't see these kind of emergent changing game worlds, or even you do not see that what you would call them, I guess, open world PvP games. There isn't one that is like super super popular. The ones that are popular are, the Fortnites and Call of Duties and others of the world where, yeah, you're in a PvP scenario, but only for a brief period of time while you play that match, right? And it's about winning and losing, and that's it, right? It isn't about, oh, our guilds are going to band together and then, like, move invade this kingdom and all this other kind of stuff. That's awesome, right? As a gameplay experience, it's pretty much, unique and one of a kind and very special, but it's also really hard to do, not
Yeah.
only from the point of view of building a world that allows that to be possible, but also the coordination and everything else on the side of the players, right? And again, some people are very into that. I think they should absolutely be allowed to do it. And the more you can allow it, in your game, the better. But there are always choices to be made from the point of view of building that game, right? Do you make it more, PVE versus PvP, et cetera, et cetera? And I would say, regardless of how awesome those experiences are, there's a limited number of people who really want to make the effort, to be involved in that, and or to deal with the trade-off of, okay, this is really cool, but my house is exposed every time I log off the server, and I'm really worried my stuff is going to be lost, which brings you to things like, player insurance, which is a wild concept when you think about it. But yeah.
It's almost like you want to have a uniform game experience for everyone, but you can't make everyone happy. Like if people are gonna have, like, let's say a WoW hardcore, people are gonna die, but then
Yeah.
the server DCs for everybody. And I know that Blizzard notoriously, like, I think they've allowed during certain DCs they'd bring back the players, especially when some streamers are involved. They'd be like, okay, we're gonna revive the
Mm,
characters, but then most other times they don't do anything about it because it
that's the
becomes
game.
ethical. Like when do you take that decision?
Right.
And I always think back, like, it just in this conversation where we're discussing community management. I feel like the CM, it's not just about communicating with the players outside the game or updating on blog posts. I think there can be a role also for them to kind of be present in the game, to take decisions in a way that, the player can feel heard. And it is such a hard balance. And I am coming from maybe a very idealist standpoint, but
No,
I
I
always,
don't think it's idealistic so much as it is, it's aspirational, really,
yeah,
because it's very, very difficult to do, you know. Um, Essentially, without sounding too pretentious, the closer that these kind of open world PvP type games, the closer they get to being a simulation of real life, or at least the systems and expectations of a real life society, the complications that come with that, right? Like, you know, like anything you can imagine in the real world. And for some people, that's fantastic. Love nothing more than that, level of detail. In fact, if you really want that level of detail, you actually want to be going off, at least at this point, and playing like text only MUDs, right? where there's but to be honest, frankly, a MUD is just a text version of an RPG, right?
Yeah.
Because there's usually a GM and they're making those decisions. In fact, arguably, that's what you want to be doing. Go off and play a TTRPG and come back, right? Like, but the reason that so many of us got sort of like into video games and stuff is frankly, especially now, but definitely even back at the early part of the video games, those graphics represented the stuff that was in our head, right? And that was why it was so compelling, right? Like to see, for example, the character design on a warrior in World of Warcraft was like, oh, that's really cool. They look really great, right? And sometimes that's just better than your imagination, And I think that's why most of us kind of got sucked into it because they were like, okay, this gives me the experience of like making a character, making them more powerful, fighting monsters and so on and so forth. And I can play it anytime I like. I don't have to worry about getting together with a bunch of people. We don't have to
Yeah.
go, pick out snacks or whatever. Now, yeah, there's a trade-off in that you're not probably going to get as memorable an experience playing that as you would potentially around a table with other people and humans who were trying to come up with that kind of stuff. And that is why I think that other sector exists, which is the PvP player economy, kind of game, because those are much, much closer to that sort of idea of like, I can do anything and the world will react appropriately to the anything that you do, because that's ultimately what we're all looking for, I believe. Like anyone playing a WoW or anything else, what we really want is what you're describing, which is like this ultimate fantasy world. There's a reason why stories like, Ready Player One, well, actually maybe not the best example, but there's actually an entire genre of fiction now called lit RPG, which is basically often about characters within essentially MMOs, right? Um, but when you look at it at the absolute core of what that is, they are all escapist fantasies, right?
Yes.
It's literally like, I want to be in that world and experience that world, right? And lit RPGs have become popular in part because an entire generation has grown up with things like WoW being their prime form of fantasy escape, right? When the previous generation, which includes me, our fantasy escape was things like Dungeons and Dragons for a long time, and therefore you sort of went from there to wanting to read books which emulated or experience media which emulated those tabletop experiences,
Yeah.
meaning
Truth. Yeah.
it's a fantasy escape, but I'm not putting myself in that world, right? Which is the big difference. And I think with things like WoW, I mean, there was always like, or in any MMOs, the number of people who would RP, who would actually try and role play characters inside the game world, was way, way smaller than the number of people who were just like playing as themselves, right? It's just that they happen to use whatever class or race or whatever it is, right? But they didn't see it as an RP experience. They just saw it as a gaming experience, which is perfectly legitimate, right? But just different. But yeah, that's ultimately what all of it comes down to in almost any game, but particularly in MMOs, is that escapist experience, which from a CM perspective is actually very important to keep in mind, right? Because I've dealt with people who you can tell um, the game is pretty much their life, and I don't mean that in a mean way, right? It's their main form of pleasure. It's their main form of escape. It's what they do probably every day, and they are deeply, deeply connected to that game experience, right? Um, and that's why sometimes dealing with them from a community perspective, you have to remember that because it's like this is not just some game, and this is not just, you know, a minor thing that they play casually every now and again. Some of these people are deeply invested, and if you change their characters or you mess with some part of the game system that they love, then you're really going to make them unhappy, you know. So it's important to kind of remember that end of the spectrum too.
I think that was the most shocking thing about retail in WoW, if we have to stick to the WoW example. And when the Blizzard guys got on stage and said, "You think," when they were asking for classic WoW, I think way back in like 2016, and they were
Uh-huh.
like, "You think you do, but you don't." And
Yeah,
I always see that as like, wow, what an oversight to think that you had such a gem of a game and like you're so convinced in your ways that do you think they stopped listening to the community? How do you get to that point where now I think half of the subs are classic and the other
yeah,
half of the subs are retail, let's say, give or take.
I think
How?
WoW's very unique because it's been around for so long, number one. And also it's never really, I mean, it's obviously gone down in popularity from where it was, but it's always had a huge, huge audience, right? If you look at something like EverQuest, I always found it fascinating that all that they seemed to do was to add on expansions that added to the level cap, right? And I'm like, they're doing that because the majority of their player base is just stuck with, one or two or three characters that they've been playing for all this time. They're all close to max level, and all they want to do is continue to level, which makes total sense, right? Um, but WoW seemed, although obviously the level cap did rise, but it felt to me like they broadened the world a bit more, right? So they were like, okay, there's new areas to explore, there are new races to play as, new classes and stuff. So they kind of made that thing of like broadening the experience. And I think that deliberately makes people go back and go, okay, I'm going to go back to level one, and now I'm going to play as a blood elf and go through and blah blah, right? Um, why didn't they sort of embrace classic earlier? I mean, I think partly it'll just be a technical thing, right? Because that
Mhm.
literally means, oh, now you're actually making two games. Just because they happen to have, the same core code base, the classic WoW code base is going to be very different from the current WoW code base. In fact, they probably didn't even build it on the classic WoW code base. They probably took whatever code base they currently had, branched it, and then they were like, all right, I need to strip out all of this other extraneous content that is from all the expansions. And I think the reason they stood up there and said, but you don't really want it, is because they probably realized that while the emotional experience of playing World of Warcraft in that first, 5 years was very strong for a lot of people, the actual reality of it was probably kind of janky in some ways, right? I mean, somebody's probably done the homework and sat down and gone, I'm actually going to compare Classic to the real 2004 vintage thing. It wouldn't surprise me if there's a bunch of quality of life in particular in the classic version that weren't there in 2004, right?
I think on that specific example, I think they re-released Wrath of Lich King. They did another server, and at the beginning they didn't have Group Finder, so they didn't put
Right.
it in the game. And then I think, and because they thought that's what players want from Classic. They want to be
Right,
able
that's
to
what you
go
want,
find their
guys.
own
You want the
groups and to
original.
fly to the next dungeon or fly to the next
Yeah.
raid. And then within like 3 months, players all hits a bunch of players started hitting Relic. Everyone's like, "Where's Group Finder? I want it back." And
Yep.
I guess you can't please everyone. Like it's it's
Yeah. I mean,
it's
don't get me wrong. I mean, EverQuest did it first. They had classic servers before WoW did, but I mean, it's honestly kind of genius, right? Because it's essentially like, I'm sorry, you want to pay us to replay the game that you played 14 years ago? Okay, like I mean, if you were EA, sorry, actually, if you were Activision, and you had a player base that were like, what we really want is for you to release Call of Duty 1 but remastered, then you'd be like, yeah, let's do that. Like it's a license to print money, right? It's a different set of economy for set of economics for an MMO because it's like, okay, we have to stand up servers, we have to have support staff, we have to probably have a different development team working on this. So yeah, there's a whole lot involved in it. It's not as simple as like, oh, we just polished up the graphics and then stuck it out on store shelves or digital storefronts. But it definitely extended the life of the game, like massively. And I think the reason is quite simply someone like yourself. I don't know when you started playing WoW, but you probably had this golden period near the beginning where you loved it more than anything else. And then 10 years pass. And at some point, you probably get to the point where you're like, I don't really play that. You either get bored of it or you just feel like there's more important things in your life. So then they go, well, what about classic? And you go, well, of course I want to play that because you want to go back and try and experience that nostalgia hit, right? I would
it
love to
was
be able to recreate, the feelings I had when I first played some games, but it's like, yeah, generally speaking, you can't get that. And WoW is an interesting example, or any MMO really, because if you actually do what they did and like roll everything back and everything else, you do end up with a very similar experience. Emotionally, of course, you're not the same. And I'm sure that a lot of people did it and were like, oh, it's not really the same. Because it's like, yeah, no, because you're not 10 years younger. But it's still a super smart thing to do. I mean, nostalgia sells, man. Like, there's a reason that we live in an age of endlessly recycled. I mean, I'm literally looking at multiple things on my desk right now that are all nostalgia based. Like, they're all either like, remakes or remasters or versions of things that are in some cases up to 80 plus years old, you know. Um, we don't really get many, quote unquote new IP these days. Um, it's a lot easier to just recycle the old ones, really.
you ever think there's going to be a next generation MMORPG. I know you have Riot trying to build one.
They've been
I know
saying that for a
they're
long time.
they've been saying that for a while. I know.
A long time.
Sometimes I
Yeah.
see a job posting on LinkedIn, or like we're looking for someone
Hmm.
for a new MMO project. But I think two questions here. A, do you think there's ever going to be another kind of wow moment with a new type of MMORPG? And then on
Hmm.
top of that, what's going to make it different? Like, what do we have to change medium? Do we have to start putting on headsets and get into VR? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you talked about the D&D kind of tabletop fantasy escape, then moving on to uh, playing on your computer, and now having kind of all that fantasy kind of
Mm.
generated to you, and then now we've kind of entered this. I think we've kind of like we're in a stasis now, where like WoW has like 5 different game modes:
Mm.
hardcore, season, discovery. You have loads of other MMOs that are like going up and down in popularity. I always wonder, like even for me personally, in my career, I'm super passionate about MMOs. I want to be around for the next one and just see what it is, and hopefully contribute. What is the next one?
I don't I don't personally think it's likely to be like a medium change. As in, I don't think it's likely to be something that's in VR or even AR. Although there was a time when I really did believe that was going to be the case. But I think if that was going to happen, it would have happened already. Because there are a few titles even on like, Quest and other VR hardware that have sought to do an MMO type experience. Um, Not many have gotten all the way because there's so much complexity and just the business of building out any MMO is a huge undertaking.
Yeah,
So to do it in VR is even bigger. If Blizzard tomorrow said we're making World of Warcraft VR, I'm sure that would be interesting to a large number of people, but I don't think every single person playing the game would be like, oh, I want to play VR now, right? Um, and that's partly also, to be honest, just a limitation of VR as a gaming system. But anyway,
yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily going to be that. There was a moment there when I thought that like something like Pokemon Go might become massive, right? There was a few companies sort of tooling around with like AR type games. Um, I don't know if there's going to be. Well, actually, here's the thing. I don't think it's a question of like what is the next big MMO. I would argue that the next big virtual world is something like Fortnite, right? Um, Fortnite kind of is that, right? Because it's not just Fortnite, it's not just Battle Royale, right? Apart from the game modes within Fortnite itself, there's like Fortnite Lego, Rocket League, and all this other kind of stuff. And also, like, the islands where you can go there and just, like, DJ music and things like that, right? They're actively building out a metaverse which doesn't require a headset, right? That I think is already here as being that thing. The difference is that we're not all going through the same experience, right? We're not all leveling. We're not all trying to get to the dungeon stuff at the end. But there is still an enormous amount of people inside that, metaverse environment, right? So arguably that's it, right? But if the criteria is everybody playing the same thing, everybody experiencing the same thing. Um, I don't even know if that's really possible now because we're so fragmented across so many different devices. Um, Fortnite has got close because it's like you can play Fortnite on your phone, you can play it on all of your consoles, your PC. For some reason, you can't play it on a Mac, but you can play it on a hell of a lot of devices. So, and they have interoperability. So, they're damn close to it. But obviously, not everybody is working towards the same objectives. You know, I think that the days of an MMO where everybody is coming in and it's kind of the theme park experience like WoW was, I don't think that's going to come around again in a way that is so culturally, relevant.
What about, I contest, GTA roleplay?
GTA
Isn't that
roleplay,
an incredible
well,
thing?
you
I
would
think it's
actually,
one of, yeah.
I could actually argue, I mean, GTA roleplay is a way of playing GTA Online, right?
Hmm.
And I would certainly see your point in that, and we'll see what happens with six, right? Although I don't know if they've even committed to online. They probably would have to. But anyway, um, GTA Online is very, very popular, but I don't think culturally it's as big an influence as something like World of Warcraft was. And I think it is purely because of the fact there's so much other stuff out there, right? Um, GTA is obviously going to be absolutely seismic next year, right? It's going to cause, I mean, it's already causing shockwaves through the industry. Um, if they pull off GTA Online, which, if you may or may not remember, they did not at launch
No.
of GTA 5, but they got it eventually, then yeah, it's going to be huge. But I don't think GTA RP is going to be the thing that makes it huge. Mostly because GTA RP is very similar to that idea of you know, a player-driven world that in theory kind of reacts to what you do within it to a certain degree, right? It's limited by literally the number of players and the number of people who want to be cops or robbers or whatever else you decided to do. And also, GTA RP has obviously been heavily, heavily pushed and um, become popular because of influencers, because it can be something when the right person is playing it that's actually kind of entertaining to watch, right? And that also is a unique thing, right? In a weird way, you have to ask yourself, like, okay, with something like GTA RP, there's a certain amount of people playing it. There's a lot more people watching it, right? And
Number one on Twitch. Yeah.
right, and you can argue, like, well, are they players in the sense of they're part of it, right? There's been a few attempts to do games that are directly influenced by influencers, as in I'm watching it on Twitch and then I can do something which influences gameplay, but none of them have really, taken off. I'm not sure why. Maybe they just weren't compelling enough. A lot of them were just like, battle royale or whatever, right? But I don't know, just for argument's sake, if you could do GCRP and then they built in, things where as a watcher, you were essentially like a citizen of the city of Los Santos, wherever the city's name is, and you had voting power, for argument's sake, that would be interesting, you know. But again, I don't think anything is going to have as much of a cultural impact just because of the fact the culture is so big and fragmented these days that, even if you're as big as Fortnite, right? Like things that happen in Fortnite don't, make the news, right? And if Fortnite releases an update, people are not queuing up overnight to get that box set, right? Which was the thing that, WoW did. Just a different world, you know. I'm still
Mhm.
honestly waiting for the probably the VR or some sort of immersive thing, as I think many people are, if you really, think about it deep down. Um, but at the same time, this is funny because I was, believe it or not, writing about this for my university thesis. Um, it's dangerous as well, right? Like you've seen this, right? We've seen examples of people who got so attached to game characters or so attached to game worlds that it became, mentally problematic. I think the more and more you become real, the more and more potentially dangerous that is for a certain portion of the population. And as we've seen recently with like chat GPT psychosis, which I know is not really an official term, but the idea of like talking to LLMs and then kind of pushing people into places mentally that they may not have gone before. And that's a text interface and
I
sometimes a
th-
voice-based interface, but it
I
sure
I
as heck
think yeah.
isn't a graphical thing. So if you start to think about what if you have the highest fidelity graphics you can imagine? What if it's being presented to you through like an Apple Vision Pro style headset, and every NPC in the thing is a decent, AI level of interaction, and then what if the world reacts, and you've literally just described an actual virtual fantasy world, right? That might be the cultural moment, but I think honestly, it's kind of dystopian, really. And
But
that's why
what
a lot of
which
these books and stuff, say that exact thing. Like Ready Player One is about a society that's basically lost itself in VR.
I kind of see it as inevitable. I
Maybe.
can't see how someone would not pass. You have lots of competing technologies all evolving around you. And even just like if we stick to the LLM example, I am waiting for an MMO to implement an LLM where rather than having in WoW, you talk to a quest giver and you get the same prompt, the same script
Yep.
in a certain situation. Imagine being able to talk to this person. You feed it a
It's been
personality,
done.
you
It's been
feed it
done in a
context
few
within the world.
places. The problem is the cost. That's simply it.
It's
The problem is the cost.
as soon
It's
as
super
it goes down,
expensive
yeah.
to have that, right? So either the cost will go down or the cost to play it will go up. Um, but so far, the difficulty is that while you can have a fantastically detailed conversation and you can get into talking about all sorts of stuff, they don't have any impact on the world beyond that, right? If you could persuade, just for example, an AI-powered king level NPC in an MMO, if you could somehow sweet talk them into, I don't know, giving you a barony, unless the game supports that, then okay, but that was just talk, right? You know, and
Oh,
also
we can get it. Yeah.
the way that LLMs work now, you could definitely make it do that, but it would say absolutely, I'm giving you a barony, and it wouldn't reflect on anything else because that's how they're programmed, right? Is to basically, be nice to you and to do whatever you say ultimately.
We're getting into like simulation theory.
Oh yeah,
Simulation theory. If you
yeah,
think
yeah.
about whenever WoW does a new server, it's a new simulation of like there's going to be one player that gets or a handful of players that get ATS the ATS staff or someone gets something. There's only so many that can get there, right? Because you need those kind of
Hmm.
groups and those collaborations and that luck to get you to that moment. And like that happens in very kind of static circumstances where that these raids open up and you level up and everything is kind of streamlined in that way. But as soon as you start opening everything up, and I don't know how quickly this technology evolves, but one can dream or at least speculate that we don't really know what the hell we're in store for in the next,
Oh no,
I'd say
no,
maybe 20
absolutely.
years.
I agree with you there. Yeah, yeah, we don't. And all I hope is that we get there in a way that is safe.
Yeah,
There was a period of time there where people were talking about how addictive WoW and other MMOs were, right? And there was definitely some people that took it too far, right? So
yeah,
there's this there's this question of like responsibility, which we're also grappling with AI generally right now, right? I would say using AI to basically make a completely immersive fantasy world that you don't need to ever leave, that's not necessarily good,
yeah. It's dangerous. It's dangerous.
even though it would be amazing, to experience, but not necessarily something that you want to strive for or that you would want society to fully embrace. I think that is generally dystopic, and that's the reason why it's been the subject of so many of these dystopian stories, right? Because it
Yeah,
doesn't really, end up well. Um, yeah.
Stephen, I'm gonna bring it back to if someone listening into the podcast is wondering how do I become a community manager? What is my pathway into becoming one? What would you recommend?
Unfortunately, I'd probably have to say, at least in games in particular, I would say think very hard about that. Um, the games industry has obviously had a really, really rough time of it in the last few years. And we have plenty of CMs, trust me. And getting in at an entry level is incredibly difficult. I would honestly say it's actually, in a really weird sense, it's easier for you to build your own community than to get yourself involved in another community, right? By that I mean it would be in a way easier for you to become a mod for a very powerful influencer. Powerful is the wrong word, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Big influencer, and get involved in their community and help them out and learn it that way, as your sort of training ground, and then potentially look, you know, to whether or not you want to do it, full time. I mean, it's a very weird job. There's no two ways about it. Like, it's a strange job. It's a strange set of um, skills and responsibilities on a daily basis, and it's definitely not for everybody. It can be very enjoyable, very fun, but it can also be, frankly, pretty miserable, right? A lot of the time you're kind of like the whipping boy or the punching bag for the community, which isn't fun a lot of the time, right? So I would very much say, like, well, think about it, right? And a lot of the time, people want to be CMs or think about it because of a game that they loved, where they saw community managers and they were like, that job looks fun, which is totally legitimate. But remember, that person is working on a specific title, with a specific company, which will not necessarily be replicated, for yourself, you know. But if you do find, as a volunteer mod or whatever, if you find that you enjoy that sort of stuff, in a weird way, that is a great way in, because at least then you can say to yourself, well, I enjoyed doing this for no money, you know, maybe I'll enjoy doing it when I'm paid, right? So that would be the way I would probably recommend people getting in now.
okay. Well, Stephen, it's been an incredible conversation. I didn't think we go down such a futuristic tangent, but maybe we have another chat again
Maybe.
about kind of everything we discussed. I would love to, but I
Yeah.
want to thank you for coming on and having this chat. It's been incredible.
Thanks for having me, man. Yeah, I appreciate it.